The lights of Maitama twinkled like distant stars, reflecting off the sleek glass walls of the Horizon Towers, an exclusive five-star hotel in the heart of Abuja. Inside, the soft clinking of wine glasses and the murmur of polite conversations filled the air as the city's elite gathered for a night of celebration. It was a private engagement dinner, one that promised to be the talk of the town for weeks. At the center of it all sat Chisom Obianuju, radiant in a custom-made gown that hugged her curves perfectly. She wore confidence like a second skin, her caramel-toned complexion glowing under the golden chandeliers. Her long, straightened hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that many admired. But tonight, she wasn't just the celebrated architect responsible for some of Abuja's most breathtaking structures, she was the future Mrs. Daniel Okonkwo. Beside her, Daniel Okonkwo exuded power and charm. His well-tailored navy blue tuxedo fit his 6-foot frame effortlessly, his dark skin gleaming under the soft lighting. He was a man who commanded attention, wealthy, ambitious, and dangerously charming. And tonight, he had given Chisom a diamond ring worth millions. The applause had barely died down when the first strange thing happened. A gust of cold wind swept through the room, though all doors and windows were sealed shut. The candles flickered, and the lights dimmed for a brief moment before stabilizing. Chisom shivered slightly. She turned toward Daniel, who was too busy clinking glasses with friends to notice. The guests continued their cheerful chatter, seemingly unaware. Then, from the far end of the room, a deep voice called her name. Chisom Obianuju. Her spine stiffened. The voice wasn't familiar. She turned toward the entrance and saw him. An old man, standing barefoot, dressed in ragged brown native attire. His eyes, cloudy with age, were sharp and piercing, locking onto hers with unsettling intensity. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the air had been sucked out. The man pointed directly at her engagement ring. "You wear the ring of a cursed union." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Who let this madman in?" Chisom's breath hitched. Before anyone could react, the hotel security rushed forward, grabbing the old man. "Get him out of here!" Daniel barked, his voice laced with irritation. The old man didn't struggle. But as he was dragged away, he never took his eyes off Chisom. And then, just before disappearing from sight, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Chisom's heart pounded. Because suddenly, the ring on her finger felt unbearably heavy. Daniel's mansion in Asokoro was the kind of home most Nigerians only dreamed of, a fortress of wealth and influence. After the dinner, he had insisted she stay over. It was their first night as an officially engaged couple, and he wanted it to be perfect. But for Chisom, something felt off. As she lay in the plush king-sized bed, wrapped in silk sheets, sleep refused to come. The encounter with the old man played on repeat in her head. The ring of a cursed union. What did he mean? She turned toward Daniel, who was already fast asleep beside her. And then? She heard it. A whisper. Faint. Almost too soft to catch. You should not have accepted his love. Chisom bolted upright. Her chest tightened as her eyes scanned the dimly lit room. There was no one there. Only the soft rustle of the curtains, though the windows were locked. Her fingers trembled as she touched the ring. It was cold. Ice cold. For the first time that night, fear settled deep in her bones. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally won, and Chisom drifted into sleep. And that's when she saw her. A woman. Standing in the ruins of an ancient Igbo palace, engulfed in flames. Her hair was woven in traditional braids, her attire regal, embroidered with gold and red. But her eyes were full of rage and pain. In her hands, she clutched a blood-stained wedding cloth. The woman stared at Chisom, unmoving. Then, in a voice that was both soft and filled with fury, she whispered, "He betrayed me, just as you will betray her." A cold shiver raced down Chisom's spine. She tried to move, to wake up, but she was frozen in place. The woman's face shifted, flickering like candlelight, until it became hers. Chisholm's own face stared back at her. And then, the screaming began. Chisholm woke up gasping for air. Sweat coated her skin, her heart slamming against her ribs. Daniel stirred beside her, oblivious. She swung her legs over the bed, gripping her temples. The dream had felt real. Too real. She reached for her phone and quickly dialed a number. Her grandmother, Mama Ebel. It took 4 rings before the old woman picked up. Chisholm? Why are you calling this early? Chisholm took a shaky breath. Mama, I need to see you. There's something wrong. There was a pause. Then, in a tone laced with concern, her grandmother replied. Come immediately, my daughter. There is something I should have told you long ago. The call ended. Chisholm sat still for a moment. And then, she looked down at her engagement ring again. For the briefest second, it wasn't gold and diamond. It was rusted metal, covered in blood. Her throat went dry. Something was terribly wrong. The first light of dawn crept over Abuja's skyline, but for Chisholm, the morning felt far from normal. She had barely slept. The dream, no, the nightmare, was still burned into her mind. He betrayed me, just as you will betray her. The woman in flames. The blood-stained wedding cloth. And the way her own face had appeared in the vision. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Chisholm barely touched her breakfast as Daniel read the news on his tablet. He looked calm, composed, and completely unaware of the fear churning inside her. You're quiet this morning, he said, sipping his black coffee. Chisholm forced a smile. Just tired. Too much excitement last night. Daniel chuckled, reaching for her hand. I told you, Chisholm. Nothing will go wrong. You're overthinking things. She wanted to believe him. But the image of the old man pointing at her ring haunted her. And so, the moment Daniel left for work, she grabbed her keys, handbag, and sunglasses and drove straight to Guagualada. The drive felt longer than usual. Maybe because her heart wouldn't stop pounding. Mama Ebel's house stood at the edge of a quiet street, surrounded by tall palm trees and a small garden full of herbs. As soon as Chisholm stepped out of the car, the old woman was already waiting for her on the porch. Her expression was unreadable. Come inside, my child, she said, her voice low. The moment Chisholm stepped through the door, she felt it. A heaviness. Like she had just walked into a place that held secrets older than time itself. The family secret no one spoke of. Mama Ebel moved to the wooden cabinet, pulling out a small clay pot wrapped in red cloth. She placed it on the table between them and sat down. What I am about to tell you, Chisholm, is something even your mother does not know. Chisholm's throat tightened. What is it, Mama? The old woman gazed at her deeply. Do you know where your family comes from? Of course. We are Igbo, our roots trace back to Anambra. Mama Ebel shook her head. Not just anywhere in Anambra. Our bloodline is from the ancient kingdom of Nrai, one of the most powerful Igbo dynasties before the British came. Chisholm frowned. She had read about Nrai history in school. Okay, so what does this have to do with me? Mama Ebel sighed deeply, then lifted the red cloth. Inside the pot lay a rusted wedding bangle. But not just any bangle. It was identical to the engagement ring on Chisholm's finger. Her stomach dropped. Mama, how? The old woman closed her eyes, as if searching for the right words. Then, she whispered. A long time ago, our family was cursed because of a betrayal. And the ring you wear is the key to it all. 1890, the betrayal that started it all. In the year 1890, a woman named Olido was betrothed to a powerful Igbo prince named Odogwu Okonkwo. But the night before their wedding, Odogwu betrayed her. He made a secret deal with the British colonial officers to gain power and wealth in exchange for something valuable. He sacrificed his bride. Chisholm's body went cold. Sacrificed her, how? Mama Ebel's eyes darkened. He gave her up to be sold into slavery. The British took her away, bound in chains. And as she was dragged to the ships, she cursed his entire bloodline. She swore that no first son of Odogwa's lineage would ever know true love. That every bride meant for them would suffer. Chisholm clutched her chest. Daniel, he is an Okonkwo. Mama Ebel nodded grimly. And you, my child, are wearing the ring of a cursed bride. The signs were always there. Chisholm's mind raced. The whispers in the night. The old man's warning at the engagement dinner. The woman in the fire, the blood-stained cloth. It wasn't just a bad dream. It was Olido. She was still watching. Still waiting. And now, Chisholm was caught in her web. You must leave him. Mama, what do I do? Chisholm asked, voice shaking. Mama Ebel took her hands, squeezing them tight. You must leave Daniel. Before it's too late. Chisholm shook her head. I can't just leave him, Mama. I love him. What if we break the curse? The old woman's face darkened. Many have tried, my child. All have failed. And do you know what happened to them? Chisholm swallowed hard. What? Mama Ebel leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. They disappeared. Some died mysteriously. Others were simply forgotten. A heavy silence filled the air. Then, Mama Ebel spoke the words that made Chisholm's blood run cold. Tell me, my daughter, do you even remember the name of Daniel's last fiancé? Chisholm froze. Her lips parted. Her mind searched. And then? She realized she couldn't. A woman who had once been engaged to Daniel. A woman who should have been famous. A woman who, now, had no name. As if she had never existed. Meanwhile, in Daniel's office. Daniel sat behind his massive marble desk, sipping a glass of whiskey. His assistant walked in, holding a file. Sir, I found the information you requested about Chisholm's grandmother. Daniel took the file and opened it. His eyes darkened. The file contained a black and white photograph. It was Mama Ebel. Standing beside her was another woman. Dressed in ancient Igbo attire. Her eyes burned through the paper. Daniel's grip tightened on the file. And then, he heard the whisper. A familiar voice. Soft, cold, and filled with centuries of pain. You will betray her, just as you betrayed me. The glass in his hand shattered. Chisholm sat alone in Daniel's mansion, her mind spinning with everything she had learned. The truth was now undeniable. She was engaged to a man from a cursed bloodline. A bloodline that had betrayed a woman centuries ago. A bloodline that was never meant to love. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Many have tried to break the curse. All have failed. And worst of all, do you even remember the name of Daniel's last fiancé? She didn't. It was as if she had never existed. Chisholm's hands trembled as she stared at her engagement ring. The diamond gleamed under the soft lights, beautiful but heavy. As if it carried the weight of the past. She knew what she had to do. She had to leave. Now. But just as she stood up to pack her bags, the lights flickered. A whisper drifted through the air. You belong to him now. The ring on her finger burned. Chisholm gasped, gripping her hand, trying to pull it off. But it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, it stayed locked onto her finger like a shackle. And then, the door slammed shut. The temperature dropped. And a shadow appeared in the corner of the room. She was here. Meanwhile, Daniel sat frozen in his office, staring at the black and white photograph. The picture of Mama Ebel, standing beside a woman who shouldn't exist. Olido. He could almost feel her eyes piercing through the paper, watching him. Then, a whisper curled into his ear. You will betray her, just as you betrayed me. The lights flickered. Daniel exhaled sharply, gripping his whiskey glass. No. I won't. I love her. But as soon as he said it, something shifted in the room. The walls seemed to breathe. The air grew thick. And then, in the reflection of his office window, he saw her. Olido. Her skin burned and cracked, her wedding gown drenched in blood. She stood directly behind him. Lies. The glass in his hand shattered. Blood dripped from his fingers, but he barely noticed. Because when he turned around, she was gone. But in his chest, a truth solidified like stone. He could never marry Chisholm. The curse would not allow it. Unless he did what his ancestors had done before. And that meant choosing between love and survival. Back at the mansion, Chisholm rushed into the bedroom, grabbing a suitcase. She didn't care if Daniel asked questions. She had to leave. But as she threw her clothes into the bag, something moved behind her. A whisper. Then, a soft laugh. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned around. And there, standing in the dim light, was a woman. Dressed in ancient Igbo bridal attire. Eyes dark as the night. Her wedding cloth soaked in blood. Olido. Chisholm's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run. Scream. Do anything. But her body refused to move. Then, Olido spoke. Leaving will not save you. The room shook. The walls cracked. And then, everything went dark. Daniel didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove to the outskirts of Abuja, following an address written on an old piece of paper. The place? An abandoned shrine. There, in the middle of a dimly lit room, sat an old priestess. Her eyes were milky white, her skin wrinkled like old leather. You came, she said without looking up. Daniel clenched his fists. Tell me how to stop this. The old woman smiled. There is only one way. Daniel leaned in. What is it? The room grew darker. The candlelight flickered violently. Then, in a voice as cold as the grave, she whispered. You must sacrifice the woman you love. Daniel's heart stopped. What? The priestess leaned closer, her white eyes piercing into his soul. You are the first son of your bloodline. You were never meant to love. If you do not offer her up, the spirit of Olido will take her anyway. And this time, she will make sure your bride suffers. Daniel gritted his teeth. There must be another way. But the priestess only smiled. There never was. Daniel's fingers dug into his palms. He thought of Chisholm. Her laughter. Her kindness. Her love. And for the first time, he realized something terrifying. Olido would never let them be together. Unless he chose survival over love. When Chisholm woke up, she was on the floor. Her head ached. The room was silent. But when she sat up, she noticed something. Her engagement ring was gone. Instead, in its place, was an old, rusted bangle. Chisholm froze. She had seen this before. At Mama Ebel's house. In the clay pot. The bangle that had belonged to Olido. Tears stung Chisholm's eyes. No, please? She whispered. And then? A voice. The choice is not yours to make. The door burst open. And there stood Daniel. His face was unreadable. His hands clenched at his sides. But his eyes? They were filled with pain. And for the first time since their engagement, Chisholm felt real fear. Because she knew. Deep down, she knew. Daniel had made his choice. And it wasn't her. Chisholm sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the rusted bangle on her wrist, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She stared at Daniel, who stood by the door, his face impassive, unreadable. But his eyes told her everything. Something had changed. There was a distance between them now, a hollow emptiness where warmth once lived. Daniel. Her voice was barely a whisper. What have you done? He didn't answer. Not at first. Instead, he walked toward her slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His posture was tense, rigid, like a man carrying the weight of something too heavy to bear. Chisholm, we need to talk. A sharp laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. Talk? After everything? After I woke up with this on my wrist? She lifted her arm, the rusted bangle catching the dim light. Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. You don't understand. Then make me understand, she snapped, standing now, her pulse hammering. I love you, Daniel. I was ready to spend my life with you. But something is wrong, something has always been wrong, and you know it. Still, he said nothing. And that was when she knew. Her voice wavered as she asked the question she was afraid of. Daniel, did you go to her? His entire body tensed. A second of silence passed between them. Then, yes. Chisholm stumbled back as if he had slapped her. Her chest constricted, tears stinging her eyes. You went to the priestess. He looked away. Chisholm. You asked her how to break the curse, didn't you? Silence. Then, finally, I asked how to stop it. She inhaled sharply. And? What did she say? Daniel hesitated. Then, in a voice so low she barely heard it, he said, She told me I have to choose between you or my survival. The words hit her like a brick to the chest. Her breath left her in a sharp, painful exhale. And what did you choose, Daniel? Meanwhile, in Guagualada, Mama Ebel was preparing for war. The air inside her small house was thick with incense, the walls lined with ancient cowries and red cloths that swayed even though there was no wind. In front of her, a bowl of river water shimmered unnaturally, reflecting shadows that didn't belong to her. She had seen it. The betrayal. The choice Daniel had already made. Stupid boy, she muttered, grinding dried herbs between her fingers. She reached for a small wooden chest and opened it, revealing a shard of old metal, part of the dagger that had once belonged to Olido. The very dagger she had tried to kill Odogwu with before she was taken away. Olido's rage has awakened. If we do nothing, my granddaughter will not survive the night. She turned to the young priestess standing beside her, a woman named Nkem, trained in the old ways. We have to prepare, Mama Ebel said firmly. Nkem's eyes darkened. This will not be easy. I know. Mama Ebel placed her hands into the bowl of water, whispering a prayer so old it no longer belonged to this world. The water rippled. And in its depths, she saw Chisholm, standing alone in Daniel's house. The bangle on her wrist tightened. The curse was already binding her. The night takes her. Back at the mansion, Chisholm felt her chest constrict. The bangle grew hotter, searing into her skin. Daniel, she choked out. Something is wrong. Her vision blurred as she dropped to her knees. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Then, a voice. It is time. The entire house shook. Daniel rushed toward her, but before he could reach her, she vanished. The air where she had been standing shimmered. And then, silence. Daniel staggered backward. Chisholm. But she was gone. And in her place, Olido stood. She smiled. Your choice was made long ago. And then, she disappeared too, leaving Daniel standing there, horrified and alone. Chisholm woke up somewhere else. The ground beneath her was cold, wet. She blinked, adjusting to the flickering torchlight surrounding her. She was no longer in Abuja. She was somewhere ancient, lost in time. Somewhere she was never supposed to be. And then she saw her. Oledo. Standing just a few feet away. The same woman from her dreams. But this time, she was real. Her wedding attire dripped with fresh blood, her eyes glowing like embers in the dark. She tilted her head, studying Chisholm like a curious predator. "You wear my bangle now." Chisholm swallowed hard. "Where am I?" Oledo smiled slowly. "You are in the space between the living and the dead." Chisholm's heart pounded. "Why?" Oledo stepped closer, her presence making the air tighten. "Because your beloved has already chosen. And now, I will take you in his place." Chisholm's knees buckled. No. No, this wasn't happening. Daniel wouldn't do this to her. Would he? Chisholm's breath came in shallow gasps as she staggered backward, her mind racing. The space she was trapped in wasn't like anything she had ever seen before. It was endless and dark, yet somehow alive. The ground beneath her was cold stone, cracked and pulsing with a dull red glow. Around her, shadows whispered. Whispers of women. Women who had once stood where she was standing. Women who had once loved men like Daniel. Women who had all been forgotten. And in front of her stood Oledo, the spirit who had haunted her dreams. Now, the woman was fully real, her once beautiful face twisted by centuries of rage and betrayal. Her wedding attire was torn and blood-stained, and her arms bore thick iron shackles, still attached to chains that disappeared into the void behind her. "You are the last, Chisholm," Oledo whispered, stepping forward. Her voice was both soft and filled with power. The last bride of a bloodline that should have ended long ago. Chisholm's chest tightened. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice shaking. Oledo tilted her head. "Neither did I. But here we are." With a sharp movement, she raised her hand. The bangle around Chisholm's wrist burned red-hot, forcing a scream from her lips. Pain exploded through her veins. "Your beloved has already chosen," Oledo whispered. "You will remain here, just as I did. Forgotten. Lost." Chisholm's body trembled. She could feel her memories slipping. Fading. Like she was being erased. Her name. Her life. Her love. They were all slipping away. "No," she whispered. "I won't let this happen." Oledo's lips curled into a cold smile. "You don't have a choice." Back in the living world, Mama Ebel moved with urgency. The time was running out. Chisholm's soul was slipping deeper into the spirit world. And if she wasn't pulled back soon, she would never return. The house was dimly lit, thick with the scent of burning herbs and incense. In front of her, a large clay pot sat on the floor, filled with water taken from the Niger River. Beside her, Nkem, the priestess, whispered ancient words, her fingers tracing symbols into the dust. "She is on the edge," Nkem murmured. "We must pull her back now, before she is completely swallowed." Mama Ebel's hands didn't stop moving as she reached for the shard of the dagger, the same blade that had once belonged to Oledo herself. "If she cannot return, we will force the spirit to release her." The room shuddered. The air grew cold. And then the candles flickered violently. Oledo was fighting back. At that same moment, Daniel sat alone in his mansion, staring at the empty space where Chisholm had disappeared. His hands trembled. His mind raced. He had made his choice. He had chosen his survival over his love. And now, Chisholm was gone. The priestess had told him that if he did not sacrifice her, she would be taken anyway. He had thought that meant death. But now, he understood something far worse. Chisholm wouldn't die. She would be erased. She would become just like the others. A woman who had once lived. A woman no one would ever remember. His stomach twisted. He reached for his phone to call her. to try and fix this. But when he pulled up his contacts, her name was already gone. As if she had never existed. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He dropped his phone. "No," he whispered. "What have I done?" In the spirit world, Chisholm felt her legs weaken. She was fading. Olido's grip tightened around her wrist, her voice now a low, hungry whisper. "Accept it, child. Your time in the living world is over." "No," Chisholm choked out. "I won't let you take me." Olido's eyes flashed. "You still believe he will come for you? That he will fight for you?" Chisholm's heart clenched. Daniel. Would he even try? Had he already forgotten her? The thought stung like fire. But just as she began to lose hope, a voice echoed through the darkness. "Chisholm, wake up!" Her eyes snapped open. For the briefest moment, she saw something. Water. Rippling water. A voice, faint but urgent. "Mama Ebel. Chisholm. Fight." Chisholm's fingers dug into Olido's arm. "I will not be forgotten." Olido hissed. And for the first time, she looked afraid. Chisholm's body burned with heat. The bangle on her wrist cracked. A powerful force surged through her veins. And then, she shoved Olido back. Hard. The spirit staggered, eyes wide with shock. The whispers around them grew louder. And in that moment, Chisholm understood. The other women. The women Olido had taken. They wanted her to win. They were giving her strength. No. Olido screamed. But it was too late. A bright light burst from Chisholm's chest, sending shockwaves through the realm. Olido let out a piercing scream as her body began to crack. And then, she shattered. The spirit was gone. And the world collapsed into darkness. Chisholm gasped awake, her body soaked in sweat. She was back. Back in Mama Ebel's house. Back in the living world. Tears streamed down her grandmother's face. "My child," she whispered. "You fought well." Chisholm felt weak, drained. But she was alive. And she was free. She looked at her wrist. The bangle was gone. Olido's grip on her had been broken. She had survived. But there was one last thing left to do. 3 days later, Chisholm stood outside Daniel's mansion. He opened the door, his face pale, haunted. His lips parted. "Chisholm." She slapped him. Hard. Tears burned in her eyes. "You were supposed to love me," she whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I thought I was saving you." She shook her head. "No, Daniel. You were saving yourself." She took a deep breath. "Goodbye." And for the first time, she walked away. Leaving him alone. With his curse. With his choice. And with the weight of a love he had lost forever. 3 months later. Chisholm stood on the balcony of her new apartment, staring at the city lights of Abuja. The skyline stretched endlessly before her, filled with possibilities and second chances. She had left everything behind. Daniel. The engagement. The shadows that had tried to claim her. She had survived. But survival came with a cost. Even now, she could still feel it, the void Olido had tried to drag her into. She wasn't sure if she would ever truly be free. But she was alive. And that was a start. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mama Ebel. "My child, how are you feeling today?" Chisholm smiled softly and typed back. "I'm getting better, Mama." "Thank you." She sent the message, then turned back to the view, breathing in the crisp evening air. The past was behind her. Or so she thought. Elsewhere in Abuja, Daniel sat alone in his darkened mansion, a glass of whiskey in hand. The once grand house felt empty, suffocating. His world had shattered. And he knew why. He had betrayed the woman he loved. He had chosen fear over faith. And now, he was paying the price. His phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He almost ignored it, but something compelled him to answer. Hello? Silence. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. You never truly loved me. Daniel's breath caught. His fingers turned ice cold. Chisholm, he whispered. The line went dead. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. And then, the lights flickered. The temperature in the room dropped. And in the reflection of his whiskey glass, he saw her. Not Chisholm, but Olido. Her burned face twisted into a smile. Did you think you were free? Daniel's whiskey glass shattered in his hand. Blood dripped from his fingers. He tried to move, but he couldn't. The shadows wrapped around his throat, tightening. His lungs burned. His vision darkened. And then, everything went black. 1 year later, a strange encounter. Chisholm sat at a cafe in Wuse, sipping her coffee. She was happier now. Free. At peace. Or at least, she was trying to be. A man approached her table. Tall. Handsome. Familiar. Excuse me, miss, but do I know you? She looked up. And her heart stopped. It was Daniel. But something was different. His eyes were blank. Like he had forgotten everything. Chisholm's fingers tightened around her cup. Daniel, she whispered. He tilted his head. I'm sorry. I don't know that name. Chisholm's breath caught. A chill crept down her spine. And then, the bangle on her wrist, the one she had gotten rid of, suddenly reappeared. A soft whisper floated through the air. The curse never ends. Chisholm's cup slipped from her hands. And as the coffee spilled onto the table, she realized the horror of the truth. The forgotten oath was never truly broken. It had only begun again. Chisholm sat in her apartment, staring at the bracelet now resting on her wrist, the very same one she had seen disappear the night she was freed from Olido's grasp. But now, it was back. Like it had never left. Her fingers trembled as she traced its cold, rusted edges. Something wasn't right. Hadn't she escaped this? Hadn't she broken free? She exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the table for support. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. Then, the lamp in her room flickered. A whisper slid through the air. You thought it was over? Chisholm's heart stopped. The room grew colder, heavier. And in the dim glow of the flickering light, she saw it. A shadow. A figure standing at the far corner of the room. And though she couldn't see its face, she knew. It was Olido. She was back. And this time, she wasn't leaving. Daniel walked through the streets of Abuja, feeling like a stranger in his own city. Something was wrong with him. He couldn't remember his past. His name felt hollow. His home felt foreign. He had flashes of things that didn't make sense. A woman's laughter. A burning palace. A voice whispering in the dark. And every time he tried to focus on those memories, a sharp pain exploded in his skull. Something inside him was missing. Something important. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember her. Not Chisholm. Not Olido. Not the curse that had shaped his entire bloodline. Everything was gone. And yet, late at night, when the streets were quiet, he still heard the whispers. Did you really think you were free? Back in Guagualada, Mama Ebel sat in the dim glow of candlelight, watching as the flames flickered violently. The spirits were restless. The curse was not broken. The cycle had merely reset. She turned to Nkem, the young priestess beside her. It has started again. Nkem's face darkened. How is that possible? We destroyed Olido's hold over Chisholm. She should be free. Mama Ebel exhaled deeply, eyes full of sorrow. Olido was never the source of the curse. She was its first victim. Nkem's body stiffened. Then who is the real master of this darkness? The old woman looked at the dying flame. And then she whispered. The one who betrayed her. The real curse was never about Olido. It was never just about a betrayed bride seeking revenge. The real power behind the curse was the first son of the Okonkwo bloodline. Every time the curse was broken, every time a bride was spared, the curse reset itself. A new cycle. A new bride to be chosen. A new love to be ruined. And now, Daniel, who had once been the cursed groom, was being replaced. Someone else would carry the burden now. The curse had shifted. It was now looking for a new man. And it had found one. For days, Chisholm tried to ignore the signs. The whispers in the night. The shadows shifting in the corner of her vision. The sound of wedding bells ringing when she was alone. She refused to believe that the curse was still haunting her. She refused to believe that Olido still had power over her. But then, one evening, as she walked into a boutique in Views, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing in front of a mirror, trying on a wedding gown, was a woman who looked exactly like her. The same face. The same eyes. The only difference was that the other Chisholm was smiling. Smiling at her. Then, slowly, the reflection raised its hand. And on its wrist was the same cursed bangle. Chisholm stumbled back, nearly knocking over a mannequin. The shopkeeper turned, startled. Are you okay, madam? Chisholm looked back at the mirror. The reflection was gone. But the bangle on her wrist had started burning again. This wasn't over. It had never been over. The curse had just chosen its new victim. And this time, it was her. Late that night, Chisholm sat in her apartment, staring at the bracelet. Her phone buzzed. A text message. From a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then opened it. And when she read the message, her entire body went cold. It's your turn now. The cycle must continue. Chisholm dropped the phone. And then, the lights flickered. The shadows in the room moved. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of a woman laughing softly filled the air. Olido had never left. The curse had just been waiting. Waiting for the next chapter to begin. Waiting for a new story to unfold. Waiting for its next bride. Do you think she can escape